Hey everybody, I hope you've been having a great holiday season this year. Last year, instead of doing a specific review for the holidays, I ended up talking about the games that I had been messing around with in the space between working on projects and such like that. That, of course, ended up being primarily RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress, and that hasn't exactly changed this year. The games that I've been messing around with in the times where I haven't really been able to do any video recording or anything like that has primarily been RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress yet again. Now, to be fair, RimWorld got a new update as well as a new expansion pack, and Dwarf Fortress got a major overhaul in the form of the Siege update, so of course both of those things really helped to freshen up those experiences, and as usual, I still very highly recommend both games. If you're interested at all in colony sims, then definitely pick up RimWorld and Dwarf Fortress. And if you're interested in the particulars as to why, go ahead and check out the videos I have on those. I'll go ahead and throw up links in the cards that pop up on the screen here. Now, all that said, that's not what this video is going to be, because talking about the same exact thing as I did last year doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But what does make sense is talking about all of the stuff that I was messing around with this year that never really made it into a full video. Now, of course, this isn't going to include everything I messed around with this year, because there were quite a few games I was messing around with that I am going to be making full videos on. For example, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, which I decided to wait until they dropped the FOV patch to finish up, because the low FOV was starting to make me nauseous. And now that they have patched the FOV slider in, I'm going to be going ahead and finishing that up fairly soon, so keep an eye out for that. And of course, there's also other projects that I've been working on and off for a while now, so keep an eye out for all those. But of course, this video is not about those games. This one's about the games that didn't necessarily make it into their own video. So without further ado, let's just go ahead and start delving into this selection of games and see what's going on with them. Now, the first game I'm going to talk about here is Banners of Ruin by Monte Barrow Limited and published by Goblins Publishing and Maple Whispering Limited. And it was released into early access back in 2020 and got its full release in 2021. And it's a roguelite deck builder in a similar vein to stuff like Slay the Spire, with all of the shortcomings that entails. You see, one of the big problems with any kind of roguelite deck builder is that you need to be able to build up a deck over time, and starting out the game, you're not going to have access to very many cards to do that with. Thus, right from the get-go, you're going to have to effectively bash your face against the brick wall that is the game's progression system until you've collected enough cards to make it through whatever the game's challenges are. Banners of Ruin is no exception in this regard, although it's handled a bit differently than something like Slay the Spire. You see, instead of having a specific character with a specific deck of cards, in this game, you have characters that are comprised of different races of beast folk. And the way this works is you start the game with mice and bears unlocked by default, and when you start a run, you get a selection of 2 characters, and you get to select which type of beast folk they are. So if you're starting the game off, you have a selection of either 2 bears, 2 mice, or a bear and a mouse. Each of the different types of beast folk have different statistics, and they also have access to certain different cards as well. And once you've selected your 2 starting party members, then you venture forth into the city and you just continue on your run and deal with whatever RNG the game throws at you. You get a selection of 3 pathways you can move on, and sometimes 1 or 2 of those paths will be blocked off, so you'll have to go a different route. And whenever you continue on the path, you will have a selection of random events. Sometimes it will be combat encounters, sometimes it will be elite combat encounters, which are tougher enemies, sometimes it'll just be special events that might get you gear or additional cards or any number of things like that. Sometimes it'll be shops where you can spend the currency that you'll just collect as you play through the game in order to get new equipment for your party members or get new cards. And sometimes you'll be able to recruit new party members. So you can have a maximum of 6 party members, but you only start with 2 of them. And whenever you come across the option to add a new party member, you will only be able to select a new party member from the beast folk that you have unlocked. So if you're just starting the game out and you only have the bears and mice unlocked, then all you will find in the taverns to get more party members is bears and mice. And then eventually when you unlock the likes of weasels and wolves, you'll start to encounter those as well, and of course you can pick those into your starting party members. As you continue on your way and successfully complete combat encounters, you will gradually earn more experience. As you earn experience, your characters will level up, and then they will be able to improve their cards or get new cards. And the general idea is that you just continue on as long as you can until inevitably, eventually, you will fall, because as with any roguelite deck builder, just starting the game out, you're not going to have the cards you need, and the game's RNG is going to be punishingly cruel to you. And after your party inevitably falls, you will be brought back to the main menu, and it will give you some experience on the different beast folk races, which will eventually allow them to level up, meaning that they can be more effective starting out in the run than when you're just starting out the game. And as you continue to play through the game, you will continue to unlock more things, and eventually you'll start unlocking the additional beast folk races, and presumably eventually you would be able to build up enough of a deck to actually be able to make it through the game. That said, I have absolutely no idea at what point that would be, because I've put a couple of hours into this thing, and it felt like I wasn't even progressing at all. Now, don't get me wrong, all roguelites, no matter what they are, whether they're a deck builder or any other type of roguelite, are without fail grindy to some degree. This is because you start the game off, and you will not be able to actually complete a run unless you are just insanely lucky during that run. The end result of this is that all roguelites require you to effectively bash your face against the brick wall until eventually you either break through that brick wall with your forehead, or you decide, you know what, I've had enough pain for now, I think I'm gonna go do something else. And the latter is exactly what happened to me with Banners of Ruin. Because when you look at a game like, say, Slay the Spire, another roguelite deck builder, another game I really don't like, even that still felt like there was some level of progression. It felt like I was getting more powerful with each run. That does not happen in Banners of Ruin. Oh sure, Bear and Mouse were gaining levels. Sure, I was unlocking more things. Sure, I was going through and leveling up the characters during the run and gaining access to new equipment and such like that, but it never felt like those characters were getting more powerful or that I was sufficiently equipped to deal with the challenges ahead. Instead, it felt like I was constantly severely underpowered, that I was never really given enough opportunities to heal up my party after combat, and no matter what I came across, it never felt like the game was giving me more tactical options to deal with the situations at hand. Instead, it was just like, yeah, you just aren't gonna have the cards for this, so, guess it's back to starting a brand new run for you. And thus, after only a few runs, I was already extremely tired of the game and was like, you know what? I think I'm done with this one. And so I uninstalled it from my Steam Deck because that's what I had been messing around with. I was trying to find different games that were actually compatible with the Steam Deck, and that happened to be one of them. And in fairly short order, it became something that I no longer have any interest in whatsoever. Now, of course, if you like roguelite deck builders, then maybe you'll be able to get something out of it, but it's definitely not something that I can recommend. Next up is Battle Brothers, which describes itself as a turn-based tactical RPG, although it's just more of a tactics game than a tactical RPG. And it was developed by Overhype Studios and published by Hooded Horse and released in 2017. And it's also had several DLCs come out over the years that have added new areas and new content, those being Warriors of the North, Blazing Deserts, and Beasts in Exploration. And the general idea here is that you take on the role of a mercenary company commander in a low fantasy medieval setting, and you'll be wandering around the world hiring mercenaries, completing contracts of various kinds, and generally just trying to survive in a rather harsh and unforgiving world. As you win battles, your band of mercenaries will earn experience, and that will gradually allow them to level up, which in turn will allow you to select special abilities for them to have, as well as improve their statistics. That all sounds simple enough, and in most other games it would be pretty straightforward, except that Battle Brothers has permadeath, so if one of your mercenaries hits 0 hit points, then it's not, oh, they're knocked out, it's they're dead, and you're going to have to replace them with a new recruit. This means that every single battle in this game, from the beginning of it on up to the end, and especially once you get to the end game, can be very tense, and it ultimately requires you to play the game slowly, methodically, and carefully. Now sure, once your party has leveled up a bit, and you have access to some decent gear, the likes of your basic bandits or even your low-level goblins aren't necessarily going to be that much of a threat to you. But of course, as we all know, overconfidence is a slow and insidious killer, so you might get comfortable with the fact that you can now deal with bandits, and then you run into some Noxeras and they tear you to ribbons. And even if you manage to get your mercenaries leveled up all the way, you get them decked out in the best gear they can find, there's still plenty of stuff that can actually pose a real threat to them, so you can never actually get complacent with this thing. You always need to be mindful of the strengths and weaknesses of the enemies you're facing. You need to be mindful of what the capabilities of all of your own guys are and what their weaknesses might be, so you can try to mitigate them as best as possible. And even with whatever preparations you make, there's still an element of random chance with things like hit probability. So just because your guy is decked out in the best gear and he's leveled up all the way, doesn't necessarily mean he's always going to hit the target. But of course, by the same token, just because the enemy you're facing is overwhelmingly more powerful than what your guys are, doesn't mean you can't mitigate those problems with judicious application of proper tactics with things like shield walls, nor does it mean that they're just automatically doomed, because there is always the chance that that incredibly powerful enemy is going to miss. And thankfully the game has a good enough balance between this random chance element and all of the preparatory and tactical stuff, so that random chance doesn't just dominate the entire experience like it has a tendency to in a lot of other games. That all said, the game isn't without its problems. On the one hand, every campaign having a procedurally generated world with different endgame crises means that you're going to have a pretty decent amount of variety with how the world layout works and which factions you're going to be encountering, what endgame crises you're going to be encountering. But it does also mean there's not really any curated content. You don't have very specific storylines that have different outcomes depending on your choices or anything like that, which is partly why I say this leans way more into the tactical side of things than the RPG side of things. The RPG side of things is mainly due to the leveling mechanics, and there is some level of choice and consequence involved, but it's primarily a mechanical choice and consequence rather than a narrative-based one. In fact, this is another bit of a weakness, but it's also not a weakness at the same time. There's not really much of a narrative with this game at all. There's plenty of setup. Obviously, you're getting your mercenary company set up, and depending on what start you chose, that's going to determine who you've got in your party and what you're actually able to do with your mercenary band. But in terms of any kind of defined narrative within the game itself, there really isn't one. It's primarily a tactics game, and it's primarily a sandbox experience. You're just wandering around wherever you feel like going, really. Wherever there are contracts available, you can go there, you can get a contract, all of which are procedurally generated, and not all of which necessarily require you to actually fight anything. Sometimes you'll take on things like caravan escort contracts, and you don't actually get assailed along the way, you just make a smooth journey from one place to another, and then you get paid for it. But that's pretty much it. All of the narrative in this game is really just setup. It's mainly about the gameplay loop of going from place to place, taking on contracts so that you can afford to keep up your ammunition stocks, as well as keep your gear repaired, keep your guys supplied with food, and of course pay your mercenaries, and just generally trying to survive in this grim low fantasy world until you can make it big as a mercenary company and start taking on more and more lucrative and prestigious contracts, until eventually you start hitting the endgame crises, in which case the realm might be invaded by orcs, or it might be overrun with undead, or a war might break out between the major noble houses, and then you have to fight along those lines. But even if you manage to get through all of that and the crisis is completed, that's still not actually a game over. There's still no real victory condition for any campaign. It's just whenever you decide you're done, or of course if you get completely defeated, then it's game over then, but otherwise it's a sandbox, and it works pretty well for the most part. It does get pretty repetitive if you only have the base game, which is why I would recommend picking up all of the DLCs so you have much more of a variety of content. But even with those DLCs included, the general gameplay experience is going to be pretty much the same, it's just with all this extra content in there. And if leading a medieval low fantasy mercenary band sounds like something you might be interested in, it's all well done enough that I would recommend checking it out. Just understand what you're getting yourself into by going into this thing, and be prepared to play it slowly and methodically, and you'll probably end up enjoying it. I certainly enjoyed it, but it may not necessarily be your individual cup of tea, depending on whether you are okay with this kind of sandbox experience, and more particularly, you're okay with the relatively limited visuals that don't really have much in the way of animations or anything like that. Although it does have some rather visceral sound effects and voice acting, which can get fairly gruesome, and it also has dismemberment, because even though it won't happen all the time, most of the time when you drop an enemy, they'll just fall over, but in some cases, you will chop their head off and it'll go flying flying across the battlefield, which is obviously pretty satisfying. Although definitely not so satisfying when it's one of your guys who gets decapitated instead. At any rate, Battle Brothers is a solid game for what it is, but I would say that the base game is a bit limited on content, so I would recommend picking it up with the DLCs if you can. And to that end, you may want to wait for a sale, because the DLCs in particular haven't really gone down in price anywhere near as much as the main game has. It's not really an overwhelmingly expensive game to begin with. I mean, the base game right now is $30 MSRP, but it goes on sale pretty frequently, and it goes on sale for a pretty deep discount. I mean, as I'm recording this video right now, it's 70% off, so it's less than $10 right now. But the DLCs are only 20% off, although their MSRPs are either half or a third of what the base game is by default. So not exactly crazy expensive, but I would still recommend waiting for a sale on it, even if this is something that seems like it's right up your alley, just because it does get a bit pricey with all of the DLCs included if you're buying them all at MSRP. If you're buying them on sale, then it's much more palatable. Next up we have the Black Grimoire Cursebreaker, which is described by the developer as a story-driven solo RPG inspired by old school games like RuneScape and Ultima Online. Solo experience inspired by MMOs. That's an odd choice there, and as it turns out, it's not entirely a solo experience, because if you decide to connect to the servers, then you can run into other players while you're wandering around in towns and such, but that's pretty much it. Once you go outside the towns, you're on your own. And while I do understand the idea that they're trying to harken back to multiplayer game stylings with that, it also presents a problem when everybody is playing the same character, which is exactly what happens in this game. Regardless of who's playing the game, you're all playing as Rothar Aircrest. So there's not really any explanation for all these other Rothar Aircrests running around. It's very odd, but anyway, that is an entirely optional thing. You don't have to connect to the servers. If you decide to disconnect from them, you will stay disconnected until you choose to connect again. So it's not really a huge problem or anything, it's just an odd quirk that they could have pretty easily avoided if they hadn't defined the player character right from the get-go as Rothar Aircrest and instead allowed you to actually customize your character. Not that it really matters all that much in the grand scheme of things, because the vast majority of this game's experience is basically like playing offline RuneScape. And by that I mean pretty much everything about this game is just a seemingly endless grind. If you can do something in this game, chances are there is a skill associated with it. You have your fairly obvious things like combat-related skills such as attack, defense, sorcery, and archery, but there's also a host of gathering and crafting skills as well. Things like fishing or mining for gathering skills, or cooking, alchemy, or smithing for crafting skills. All of these different skills are leveled up by simply engaging in that skill. So attack is leveled up by attacking enemies in melee, and if you manage to hit them, then it will give you experience for it. Defense is leveled up over time passively effectively by being attacked. Sorcery is leveled up by casting spells. Mining is leveled up by mining out ore. Smithing is leveled up by crafting equipment at an anvil, and so on and so forth. And then alchemy is a bit of an odd one out there, because you gain experience for that by both gathering materials for creating potions and such, and by actually brewing the potions themselves. The thing is that skills in a game like this are a bit counterintuitive, because you would think that as you level up the skill, you get better at whatever it is. The reality is that the level you are in a skill primarily determines what you can actually use or achieve with that particular skill. And that's going to require a few examples. So for example, with the attack skill, leveling up that determines what abilities you are allowed to learn at the trainer, as well as what weapons you are allowed to equip. So out of the gate, you can't simply wander around, find a really powerful weapon, and just start using it. Instead, you have to level up your attack skill to the point where it will allow you to equip that weapon. Same kind of thing goes for the defense skill. As you level that up, it will unlock different armor pieces that you are allowed to equip. Same kind of thing goes for the gathering skills, but it determines not so much what you can equip, but more what you're allowed to gather with that skill. So if you're mining, for example, you'll start out only being able to mine out copper ore. But as you continue to level that up, not only will you unlock different skills associated with it that you can then purchase at the trainer, but you will also gradually unlock the ability to mine better ores and equip better pickaxes. pickaxes. When you move over into a crafting skill, it will determine what you're allowed to craft. So starting out with smithing, you'll only be able to craft a small number of copper items, and you will gradually unlock more and more copper items as you continue, until eventually you do unlock the ability to create iron equipment, and then it keeps going on from there. This is where the vast majority of the gameplay is going to be centered, because grinding up these various skills is how you actually progress in this thing. You don't simply level up over time by collecting experience points. Instead, all of your progression is tied to these skills. If you want to equip better equipment, you have to grind out your combat skills. If you want to get better gear, more often than not, the main way you're going to be getting that is by crafting it yourself. There is certainly some equipment that you can just find either as loot drops from enemies or just scattered around the environment in chests or as quest rewards, but the majority of your equipment progression is probably going to be from stuff you crafted yourself. And the quests you'll be able to go on are also tied into this progression system, because a lot of them require you to gather materials, or they require you to fight specific enemies that you need at least gear of a certain type to actually be able to stand a chance against them. And there's even really odd quirks with that, like hit points being tied to what armor you have equipped. Yeah, you start out with a very low amount of hit points by default, and then you increase that value by equipping better armor, which just gives you a whole bunch more hit points on top of giving you more damage resistance. It's a pretty odd progression system, even by the standards of MMOs, let alone single-player RPGs. And even then, I wouldn't even necessarily call this an RPG, because there's not really any role-playing to speak of. It's an entirely mechanically focused game where the story is completely linear. There is no way of making different choices and having those choices play out in different ways, and you don't really have any actual agency over the way the character itself plays out. You have all of the skills available to you at any time. It's just whatever you happen to be using at any given time is going to determine what skills you're leveling. And those skills are all leveled in a completely linear fashion as well. There's no making different choices to figure out what different abilities you have. Now, you can get all of the abilities if you really want to. It's just a matter of grinding out the skill and then spending the gold at the trainer to get all the skills. But if it's not a role-playing game, and it's certainly not an MMO, because it's definitely not a massively online game, what is this thing? Because it's not really an action-adventure game either. The combat system is not really action-based. It's click-and-wait combat, much like in RuneScape, where you just click on an enemy and you will start auto-attacking them, and you can use abilities in your hotbar if you want to, but obviously starting out the game, you're barely going to have access to any of them, and it's not really going to matter all that much. It does have a slight timing element to it, because, for example, if you have a shield, you can use the shield block ability to hold your shield up, and then an enemy can attack you, and it will block that attack and not do any damage to you. But otherwise, you can't really say it's an action-based combat system either, so it's not really an action-adventure game. It's not really an action RPG. It's not really an RPG. It's definitely not an MMO. What the heck is it? I guess the best genre descriptor for it would be something like a sandbox adventure game, because it's not really an adventure game either. Adventure games can have combat. You can have games like, say, Quest for Glory or Gemini Rue, which do have combat in them. But ironically enough, I would even say something like Quest for Glory is actually more of an RPG than this thing is, because you can make choices as your character, and those choices can play out in different ways. Namely with things like whether you choose to become a paladin or not. But even though those are very simplistic choices in a game like Quest for Glory, there's still choices you can make that have an effect on the way the story and the gameplay plays out, which is just not how the Black Grimoire Cursebreaker works. That's not necessarily to say that this game is bad at what it's doing. I mean, what it's doing is trying to be an offline representation of RuneScape's gameplay, and it does that pretty well. It's just that when I try to describe what genre it's in, it gets really messy there, and we don't really have a good genre name for something like an offline MMO. But regardless of what I can actually classify it as, what I can say is that the only people this game is really going to appeal to are fans of old school RuneScape. And unfortunately, it's even only going to be a subset of those people, because chances are, if you're a fan of old school RuneScape, you're going to take a look at this and go, oh, okay, and then you're probably just going to go right back to old school RuneScape. But if you're one of the subset of gamers that this does appeal to, which is basically people who played old school RuneScape and said, man, I like this, but I wish this were an offline game, well, Cursebreaker is basically the game for you. The next game I'll be taking a look at here is called Cat Quest. It was developed by the Gentle Bros and published by Kepler Interactive and released back in 2017. And it's another of the games that I was messing around with on the Steam Deck, and it actually worked quite well on that. But I have to read you the store page blurb for this, because, well, you'll understand here in a moment. And I quote, "The multi-award-winning action RPG. Some say Diablo with cats, others a super cute Skyrim. Whatever your take, Cat Quest's loot-fueled cat venture is as beautifully crafted as its combat and magic are ultra-satisfying. Universally adored by critics, it'll have you purring for joy." Cue Tim Robinson saying, "Are you sure about that?" Because pretty much none of that is right. Yes, it did win a couple of awards, so they got that down, but it's certainly not an action role-playing game. There's no role-playing in this game at all. There are no choices to make, and thus there are no consequences for those choices to experience. The progression itself is extremely linear. You have no way of really customizing your character beyond whatever gear and spells you're equipping, and you can just swap those out with whatever you have available. Really, the only way the action RPG title is not so incorrect is the action part of it. Just swap out RPG with adventure, and you get closer to what this game is. So let's continue on through the rest of this. Some say Diablo with cats. No, not even close. There is basically no loot to speak of in this game. What little loot you will receive is gained from opening chests in dungeons and such like that. And dungeons basically consist of caves and not really much else. And as for the loot you're receiving, well, there's pieces of armor or clothing, and then there are weapons, and you will find repeats of both of these things throughout the game. And when you find repeats of these things, they will just replace whatever you already had with a more powerful version of it. And by more powerful, I just mean the numbers go up a bit. So I guess in the sense of number go up, you can say it's kinda tangentially related to Diablo, but number go up is a feature of pretty much any game out there these days, so still not really Diablo with cats. Then, super cute Skyrim. I have no idea what they're even talking about there. No idea other than maybe the idea that Skyrim has become a mockery of itself over the years, and Cat Quest is kind of a parody game, so maybe that's what they're going for. I really don't know. And then we continue on here. Loot-fueled cat venture, we already mentioned. There's basically no loot to speak of. And combat and magic are ultra satisfying. They're very basic, they're functional, they're fine for what they are, which this game is basically just a mobile game when you think about it. And by mobile game standards, it's decent enough for what it is, but it's nothing particularly special. And then, universally adored by critics. Yeah, I don't feel the need to say anything about that. It'll have you purring for joy. I have never purred for joy at anything. Now, all that said, that probably sounded really harsh. And it is to some degree, because I really hate this kind of marketing speak. When they really try to build something up to be way different than what it actually is. Because that creates expectations that are wildly different from what the game can actually deliver. Now, I don't necessarily mind all the cat-themed puns and everything, because that is exactly what Cat Quest is up to. But they're actively trying to build it as a role-playing game when it simply isn't. They're actively comparing it to games that it has basically nothing to do with. And so you might go into this game expecting, say, Diablo with cats, or super cute Skyrim, and you're going to get neither of those things and be like, what the hell were you talking about there? And that's going to inevitably make your judgment of the game's faults considerably harsher, because this is a very simplistic, extremely easy, and extremely repetitive game. Something clearly designed to be played in very short sessions, probably on a mobile device, and with the player not really putting much thought or effort into it. Because if you do start thinking about it, you realize, oh yeah, the combat is really simplistic. You have a melee attack, and you have a couple of spell slots, and you can dodge. And that's it. And none of that was anything out of the ordinary for games of this perspective and general gameplay style. even at the time the game originally released, let alone these days when it is just completely ubiquitous and is basically the bare minimum you need to do. And if you're comparing it to other, say, PC and console games, it's obviously going to fall quite short. If you compare it to mobile games, on the other hand, it comes out smelling like tulips because, frankly, the mobile game market is saturated with absolute garbage. And at the end of the day, this is a rather simplistic action-adventure game about a cat going on an adventure to rescue his sister from the evil wizard Dracoth, and absolutely drowning the player in cat-related puns the entire time. It is a very simplistic, repetitive, casual experience, and if you go into it treating it like that, then you might be able to get something out of it. If you go into it with expectations from what the ad blurbs tell you, however, and say that it's, a super cute Skyrim or a Diablo with cats, you're going to be disappointed. Go into it with the right expectations, though, and you might be able to enjoy it. Just don't expect anything amazing here, because you're not going to get a compelling story out of it. The gameplay mechanics, while decent enough for what they are nothing particularly special in the grand scheme of things, and there's a very decent chance that getting constantly assailed by all of the cat puns will eventually drive you mad. Next up, we have Dysmantle, developed by 10 Tons Limited, and originally released into early access back in 2020, with its full release coming in 2021. And the idea behind this is that it's sort of an open-world survival craft game. It's not really a survival game. There's not really any actual survival elements to it. But it's a post-apocalyptic game where you start the game off emerging from your shelter after having run out of supplies after a couple of years of the situation being ongoing. And the general idea is that you're trying to find a way off of the island that you're stranded on, so you're ultimately just collecting various materials so you can construct better gear and just gradually fight your way through the hordes of zombies and such until eventually you manage to find a way off of the island and, of course, figure out what happened on the island to get this apocalyptic scenario in the first place. And the big gimmick with this game is that you can basically just dismantle everything in the world. So it's not just breaking things like crates or barrels or things like that to get scrap materials. It's also dismantling things like electrical equipment, vehicles, walls even. You can knock down entire buildings if you want to. And all of that is going to yield materials that you can then use to craft various equipment as well as build your own structures in certain base areas. That in itself is a neat idea, but the game has a few pretty significant problems. The first is that it's incredibly grindy because of this. You have a very limited amount of inventory space, and so you're just going to be collecting materials as you go through, regardless of what you're doing, and eventually that inventory is going to fill up, so you're going to have to run back to a stash location in order to drop off materials so you can then go back out and continue collecting materials. And starting out the game, you're not going to be able to carry much at all. You're going to have to craft the upgrades to your carrying capacity so that you can then carry more materials, which of course means finding the materials to craft those with, and that of course means going out and finding whatever it is you have to dismantle in order to get those materials. But as you're trying to find these materials, you'll find out very quickly that the tools you have to bash things apart, because that's all you're ever doing when you're dismantling things, you're just whacking them with whatever tool it is to dismantle it. But anyway, each of these tools has a damage value, which you would think would only apply when you're using it as a weapon, but it's actually just a general statistic to tell you what you can actually damage and how much damage it's actually going to do. And each object in the environment has different tools that are necessary to dismantle it and different damage values that are necessary to dismantle it. So even if you have the right category of tool equipped, that may not necessarily be sufficient unless it can do enough damage to actually destroy that object. So essentially the gameplay loop is actually just finding ways of getting the upgraded tools that you can then use to dismantle more objects so that you can get upgraded tools to dismantle more objects. And yeah, in case you can't tell, this game gets extremely repetitive and tedious very quickly. And to make matters worse in this regard, in order to get certain upgrade materials, you need to go out of your way to go fight particularly powerful enemies, which of course require more powerful weapons to deal with, thus feeding further into that grind. And in certain areas, you need certain equipment in order to simply stay alive in that area. So you go to certain areas and you'll be afflicted by hypothermia. And if you go into other areas, you'll be afflicted by hyperthermia. So you need to get appropriate clothing to deal with the changes in temperature. And that's going to be a matter of leveling up your character and unlocking the ability to craft whatever particular set of clothing it is in order to progress. And it just becomes this extremely repetitive, extremely tedious grind almost immediately, and it only seems to get worse the further you get into the game. And as if this resource upgrade equipment grind loop weren't bad enough, there's also the enemies you have to fight. Now, most of them are very simplistic, and there's not much to the combat system itself. You just whack them and try to dodge out of the way, and that's kind of it. But there are certain enemies that are particularly powerful. Some of them have certain special abilities that you need to be aware of. And there's also the somewhat Souls-like element of these enemies respawning, and wherever you die, you drop whatever you were carrying, and you have to go back and get it all. Now, there is a way to prevent the enemies from respawning, but you can only do that in a region-by-region basis, and as with everything else in this game, it costs a lot of fairly hard to find materials, so you're going to be fairly limited on when you're going to be able to do that, unless you just happen to have a resource surplus. This, of course, does mean that when you manage to prevent the enemies from respawning and you've dealt with all of them in a region, you don't need to worry about that region anymore. You can just go around and dismantle everything to your heart's content, but then again, there's nothing to spice up that gameplay at that point. You're just gathering resources so that you can craft upgrades, and that's kind of it. I did mention that you can build your own base if you really want to, but there's not really much of a reason to. You don't really get any benefit from doing that except for some crafting stations that you can actually set down in a place that's more of a centralized location, as opposed to wandering around and finding the crafting locations. And when you bring the whole experience together, it just ends up being incredibly boring more than anything else. Maybe you might be able to get something out of it if, for whatever baffling reason, the resource grind seems appealing to you, but I can't recommend it at all. Next up, we have Kingdom, now referred to as Kingdom Classic, developed by Noyo and Licorice and published by Raw Fury and first released back in 2015. And this is one of those games that I was trying out on my Steam Deck, and it ended up being a frustrating mess, because Kingdom is a side-scrolling, I guess you can technically call it a strategy game. It's not really much of a strategy game, honestly, where the idea is you play as the monarch and you are traveling around on your kingdom in a side-scrolling fashion on horseback, and you're trying to defend your kingdom against hordes of monsters that spawn from either side of the map every night, which entails constructing defensive structures as well as hiring soldiers that will then be able to attack those enemies and deal with them. The main method you will be using to do all of these things is applying coins. Now, you have a coin purse that's shown up in the top right of the screen, and even though it does have a limited capacity, it doesn't really give you a number on what that capacity is. You just have to count the actual coins showing up in it, which is a bit messy at times, especially once you get later on in the game and you start getting a lot of coins all at once. But anyway, there are three main methods by which you will earn coins. The first of them is that at the beginning of each day after you've survived the night, a chest will spawn in your base and you'll be able to open that for a few coins. The second is that your archers will be able to hunt small game and deer, and when they do that, they will collect coins from it, and when you move past them, they will drop whatever coins they've collected. The third method requires a bit more setup, which is farmers. Once you've expanded your base enough, you will be able to build a farm with the coins, and then you can turn peasants into farmers, and then once they have completed their farming for the day, then they will give you a large amount of coins. In fact, the farmers are going to be your main method by which you're going to earn coins. And the basic idea here is that you're going to be running around and trying to get to the various refugee camps and drop a few coins for the wretches there to become peasants, and then they will go off to your base, upon which they will collect whatever tool is immediately available to them. If it's a bow, then they'll become an archer. If it is a hammer, then they'll become an engineer, and engineers can build the various structures that you can use for defenses, and they can also operate siege engines once you've unlocked those. Meanwhile, if there's a scythe available, they will become a farmer, and if there is a shield available, they will become a knight. Now, knights are melee fighters. They can tank quite a bit of damage before going down, so they're kind of your front line of defense, with the archers supporting them, and then you will build up these forces and continue to push out further and further into the wilderness until you eventually encounter portals. There are 2 portals each on the left and right sides of the map, and you will need a large force to destroy those portals and prevent the monsters from spawning in. The more progress you make with this and the longer you survive, the more powerful enemies the game will throw at you until eventually you will probably be overrun, especially if you're just starting out, because the game is completely non-intuitive as to how you're actually supposed to play it and what your so-called strategy is supposed to be. The reality is there's really only one way to play this game, and that way is to play it in a very unintuitive way. You would think that you would just want to gradually expand outwards, and that is true to some degree. However, you need to be careful not to go past the refugee camps, because once you do that, those refugee camps disappear and you lose a source of peasants. And if you don't have a source of peasants you can quickly and easily get to replace your fallen forces, you're just screwed. You may be wondering how that's counterintuitive. Well, in order to get your army to where they need to be to destroy the portals, you need to continue expanding, because your forces will only assemble at the furthest wall away from where your base is. Which of course means you're going to end up going past the refugee camps, which in turn means that you're not going to be able to replenish your forces from that area, and it's just going to get real messy real quick. To make matters worse in this regard, your horse has stamina, so if you try to gallop at full speed, then you will very quickly find yourself running out of horse stamina, and it will have to sit there and recharge its stamina before you'll be able to move at full speed again. So the further you expand outwards, and the more you have to go out there to apply coins to whatever's out there, whether it be shrines to improve the quality of your buildings or your archers, or build further defensive structures, or order your engineers to chop down trees or whatever, the longer it takes to get back to your base, the more you're going to be running out of horse stamina while doing so, and the more vulnerable you're going to leave yourself, because if your army is not capable of defending against whatever wave of enemies is spawning in, you're just screwed. The end result of all of this is a game that is so incredibly limited in what you're able to do with it that at best it's basically a fancy flash game, and at worst it's just a tedious and frustrating chore. And the worst part is, you'll only ever beat it once. Because once you've beaten the game, there is absolutely nothing else for you. There's no New Game Plus, there's no additional enemies that you'll be fighting, there's no additional things you'll unlock. There's just starting a new game and doing the exact same thing you had just been doing. So it has basically no replay value whatsoever, even though they do randomly generate the layout of the map somewhat. So there is some vague sense of variety there, but it's definitely not enough to carry the experience. Since you have no control over your army, there is no tactical depth to speak of, since there's only one real way to play the game if you're ever going to be victorious. It's not really much of a strategy game at best, it's more like a puzzle game, and with how ridiculously simplistic and repetitive it is, I can't see myself recommending it at all. Nor can I see myself recommending the follow-up game to it, which is Kingdom New Lands, which is basically just Kingdom, only they decided to spice things up by placing you on an island, and in order to actually beat the game, you need to construct a ship so that you can navigate to the next island, at which point you start the whole process of building up defenses and an army all over again. So it's basically like a mini campaign of just repeating the same thing over and over again. They did expand the mechanics a fair bit, so there's more things that you can spend coins on to better bump up your defenses and get your army into a better position to expand outwards and destroy those portals, but it's basically the exact same gameplay loop with the exact same problems. Really, the biggest saving graces for these games are, first off, that the pixel art for all of them is pretty solid, so they look nice at least, and the soundtrack's decent. But really the big one is that Kingdom Classic is free, so you can just add it to your Steam library and play it to your heart's content, although I wouldn't really recommend it. And Kingdom New Lands, even though you do have to pay for it, usually goes on sale for really cheap. We're talking about $3 US. I still would say that you definitely have much better options if you're looking for a sort of bite-sized strategy game, because there's really not much strategy to be had in these games. But if they look like something you might be interested in, maybe give the original Kingdom a shot, and if you like it, maybe consider something like New Lands, but I can't really recommend either of them. Next up, we have Loop Hero, developed by 4 Quarters and published by Devolver Digital and released in 2021. And while this game is a roguelite in the sense that there is a run-based progression system where you start a run, you inevitably will fail on that run, and then some of the materials you collected are retained, and you can use those materials to construct different things at your home base, which will then give you new bonuses and such. But in terms of how it actually works mechanically, it's fairly odd. You see, you don't really have any actual control over your player character. Instead, you have control over the world around the player character during that particular run. And by that I mean you periodically get cards that will give you some sort of terrain feature that you can then place in the world around the pathway that the hero is walking along. And while that can do a number of things, primarily it's going to give you resources, or it's going to spawn enemies, or sometimes it's going to do both. So weirdly enough, there's not actually much gameplay in this. I mean, sure, you're swapping out the gear that the hero has equipped whenever you find stuff that's better than what you previously had, but you don't really have any control over the battles. The only thing is you're actually doing are placing these various terrain features in the environment, as well as swapping out the gear, and then whenever you inevitably fail your run, because that's just how this kind of game works, you're selecting how to expand and improve your base so that you can get additional bonuses on your next run. The only other real interaction is just choosing when to end that particular run, because you can either just let the run play out and probably end up getting annihilated, or you can end the run early and return to base camp with more resources than you would have retained had you actually gone through the entire run and ended up dying. The only other thing to keep in consideration is that there is a meter that gradually fills up as you continue to add terrain features, and once you've added enough of those, then it will trigger the boss spawn, and then you'll end up going and fighting the boss and probably losing fairly handily until you've managed to get a few runs down and managed to unlock enough upgrades at the base camp. And of course, the biggest boon for you in something like that, simply gotten really lucky on that particular run as far as the gear drops go. All in all, it's a very grindy game that, while it has a nice pixel art aesthetic going on, doesn't really have much in the way of gameplay and very quickly becomes extremely repetitive and very boring, and I cannot recommend it as a result. Next up, we have Roadwarden, which describes itself as an illustrated text-based RPG, combining mechanics borrowed from RPGs, visual novels, adventure games, and interactive fiction, and it was developed by Moral Anxiety Studio and published by Assemble Entertainment and released in 2022. And honestly, there's not much to say about this game because it's not really an RPG as much as it is just a visual novel, and not even really much of a visual novel. There's really not much to look at in this game. You're looking at just a top-down view of whatever environment you're in for the most part, and everything else is handled through text. There's no voice acting that I've encountered up to this point anyway, and it's all just a lot of reading. And I'm not really opposed to reading, obviously I read books all the time, but the thing about making a text-based game or a novel or any kind of written fiction is that if you're not relying on things like cinematics or, say, visual graphics, you're relying on the strength of your writing, and the writing in Roadwarden is just not really all that interesting. It does a decent job of describing things, but even though the game has a time limit of 40 in-game days on the standard difficulty and 30 on the higher difficulty, you never really feel like there's any sense of urgency to anything that you're doing. You never really feel like the mystery of what happened to the previous Roadwarden is actually all that engaging. Most of the NPCs you talk to really aren't all that interesting and just end up being pretty bland. And the game does an absolutely atrocious job of giving the player good indications about what they're supposed to be doing, why they're doing it, and how they're supposed to go about achieving whatever it is they're trying to achieve. When you're given objectives, a lot of times they tend to be pretty vague, and how you're supposed to get to wherever it is that those objectives are is even more vague, or even outright inaccessible until much later on, and half the time you try to venture off and do something that seems interesting, the game outright punishes you for doing it. For example, if you start wandering off in one particular direction, you'll inevitably run into some group of enemies, whether it be bandits or goblins or some other monsters or whatever, and think to yourself, oh cool, combat, this is gonna get interesting, and then if you actually engage in combat, the game proceeds to stomp you into the ground. And as you look at the game over screen, you're sitting there wondering, oh, okay, what did I I do wrong? Well, as far as you can tell, it's that you attempted to engage in combat at all. Which of course begs the question of why even include combat if it's clearly the wrong decision. Now obviously, there's an answer to all of this. There are tricks to everything in this game, but they basically require you to have already played through the entire thing and exhausted pretty much every option available to you to understand how it all works. And if that's how you're going to handle things, why did you bother making this an interactive product? Why didn't you just write an actual novel? Weirdly enough, I feel like this probably would have worked a lot better as a just standard novel, or if you had to make it some sort of interactive medium, just make it a choose-your-own-adventure book. You know, one of those classic, you read the page and then you get to the end of it and it says, you do this thing, go to page whatever, or you do this other thing, go to whatever other page, and then you do that. Instead, there are just these awkwardly shoehorned in gameplay mechanics of some description that are just not intuitive and really not engaging at all, and the entire thing feels like it was designed to be played through by somebody who already knows how everything progresses anyway, which is thoroughly counterintuitive, and overall, I really can't recommend this thing to anybody. And last for this particular video, I'll be taking a look at Zoeti, I think is how you're supposed to pronounce that, developed by Dusklight and published by Akapara Games and released in 2023. It is a turn-based roguelite, as they describe it, which is kind of a roguelite deck builder, but not really, because you're not actually building a deck of cards. You're getting a bunch of abilities that you then assign into slots based on what card hands you want to use. So you have things like 1 pair, or 2 pair, or 3 of a kind, or 4 of a kind, or a full house. And since you'll draw new cards every turn, you'll get a new selection of hands which you can play, and that will determine what you can ultimately do on any given turn. Now at first, it seems like it might be kind of a neat idea, except it means that your abilities are considerably more limited than even most other roguelite deck builders, and it's also just a really boring way of actually handling the way you deploy your abilities. It also presents a mild problem for people who don't particularly care for poker or know nothing about poker, because it's using poker hands, and if you don't know what constitutes a poker hand, you're not necessarily going to know what cards in your hand actually fit what abilities you have. The interface does mitigate this somewhat by showing you what abilities you can actually activate based on what cards you have in your hand, and when you click on it, it will pull up a selection of cards that fit that hand, but it is something to keep in mind, because that's going to be a bit off-putting for people who don't necessarily care for poker. And while I'm talking about poker, I do have to just bring this up. What is up with people who like poker? They act like everyone else should know how to play it and should absolutely love playing it, and that the very notion of not liking poker or not knowing how to play it is just utterly inconceivable. I mean, really, the response you will get most of the time when you say, yeah, I don't know how to play poker is, what, wait, seriously? Like, it's just expected to be some sort of general life skill that you're just supposed to know, like, say, tying your shoelaces or something. Oh, and God forbid you say you don't like playing poker, then they'll just treat you like you somehow managed to escape from an insane asylum. Anyway, I don't want to get too horribly off topic here, but suffice to say that the poker hands part of this game just doesn't really feel like it fits very well, and the general gameplay experience just becomes rather dull rather quickly. Because it very much feels like they looked at something like Slay the Spire and said, yeah, we can do that, but didn't really know what to do as far as the actual deck building mechanic goes, so they said, screw it, we'll just do poker hands, that'll work. I mean, sure, it's functional, it does work, but it's a rather boring way of handling the abilities, and the rest of the game just doesn't really make up for that. So, unless the idea of playing a roguelite deck builder that doesn't really have much in the way of progression and uses poker hands instead of actual deck building cards appeals to you, I can't recommend it. And that covers all the games I've messed around with enough this year that I've been able to formulate thoughts on them, but weren't necessarily going to get full reviews and hadn't made it into their own videos yet. I hope you all enjoyed it, or that it at least helped you in some way. Thank you all very much for watching and for bearing with me all throughout the year on how sporadic the video uploads have been. There has just been an awful lot going on, so I again really appreciate you bearing with me during all that. Now of course, this is going to be the last video I upload in 2025, but I will be back in the new year with new videos, reviews, MTOs, games that infuriate me to no end, all manner of stuff like that. And it'll be a combination of new and old games as I usually do, so keep an eye out for all of that. Oh, and speaking of keeping an eye out for stuff,